Patients with PTSD often ruminate about their trauma and its consequences. In this video, we'll focus on how to help clients spot and overcome rumination with a range of cognitive therapy interventions. Rumination is a repetitive negative thinking style. It's often triggered by trauma memories or trauma reminders, but it can also start voluntarily. Rumination is often linked to appraisals of self-blame, injustice, or betrayal. Once it gets going, patients find it very hard to stop, and it can take up a significant amount of time. The goal in cognitive therapy for PTSD when addressing rumination is to guide clients to discover what it is, why it's unhelpful, and how they may disengage from rumination once it gets going, or how they may prevent it from starting in the first place. In this video, I'll talk you through the list of techniques listed here, which have the overall goal of guiding clients to disengage from rumination. The first step in addressing rumination is to make the distinction between intrusive memories and rumination. Rumination is a common response to unwanted intrusive memories. Intrusive memories and rumination have in common that patients find them very hard to control. Patients usually do not make the distinction between these two processes and refer to them interchangeably as remembering or thinking. The therapist will want to educate the client that whereas intrusive memories refer to re-experiencing sensory aspects of the trauma, rumination is not memory. Rumination is unproductive, circular thinking around the trauma, dwelling about the trauma. For example, how would my life be different if the trauma hadn't happened? Or why didn't I do more to prevent the trauma, for example? For patients who do not spend a lot of time ruminating during the day, this education is often sufficient to bring about the realization that rumination is unhelpful and may make things worse. The therapist may want to expand on the train going through a station analogy introduced in the first session by comparing rumination to jumping on the train of thoughts and going over every detail, which usually does not bring about resolution of unpleasant feelings. The passive stance of letting the train come in and then leave the station will be more helpful than thought suppression or rumination. It will be very helpful to elicit the advantages and the many disadvantages of rumination for clients. Helping clients to discover that there are many more disadvantages to advantages of rumination can often serve as motivation to disengage from this thinking process. In this therapy clip, we see the therapist guide the client to spot the advantages and the many disadvantages of rumination. So we've been talking about rumination and how you dwell when you're reminded of the trauma.
Yeah, I can't help thinking about why it happened.
I totally understand. I wonder if it might be helpful to draw out the advantages and disadvantages of rumination, to think through how it might be helping if it is helping you, and how it might not be helping, so the disadvantages. Does that sound like it might be helpful to do?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, so let me just share screen, and on our whiteboard, I'll draw a column here for advantages, and then a column on the opposite side for disadvantages. Let's start with the advantages. What are some of the advantages you've noticed about rumination?
It helps me think through what happened so I can make sure I really understand why the trauma happened and maybe prevent another one.
And has rumination led to any answers about why the trauma happened? Do you have a clearer sense about why it's happened now?
Well, I understand that the trauma happened, but I have no idea why. I don't know the men who attacked me. I don't know why they attacked me. So maybe dwelling hasn't led to any answers.
It sounds like it hasn't led to any answers, but it's kept you focused on the trauma. So I'll put, it's kept me focused on the trauma. Does that sound okay?
Yeah, that sounds right.
Okay. Any other advantages?
I can't think of anything.
Okay, well, let's move to the disadvantages. What are some of the disadvantages that you've noticed about rumination?
It takes up a lot of time.
It does take up a lot of time. Anything else?
My friends say when I'm going over the same questions, it's hard to talk to me.
Okay, so it makes it hard to talk to my friends.
Yes.
And what have you noticed in terms of how ruminating makes you feel?
I actually feel pretty rubbish, low, and like I don't want to see anyone.
Okay. So, in terms of the disadvantages, it sounds like it takes up a lot of time. It makes it hard to talk to your friends. You feel rubbish, low, and like you don't want to see anybody.
Yeah.
So, looking at the advantages and disadvantages, what do you notice? Are there more advantages or disadvantages?
So many more disadvantages than advantages
And what does this tell you, Sienna?
that I don't think it's helpful to ruminate. It makes me feel worse, and I'm not getting many answers when I do ruminate.
Exactly. So, I'm wondering if a helpful next step would be to put our heads together and create a plan to put in place when you spot that you are ruminating. How does that sound?
Like it could be very helpful.
Great. It is also very helpful to help clients spot and label rumination as a step in disengaging from rumination. Why and if only thoughts are common signs of ruminating, as are should thoughts, and questions that lead to no plan or action, the unanswerable questions. If a client has been thinking on the same thought for more than 30 minutes, it's likely they're ruminating. As a first step in disengaging from rumination, it can be helpful for clients to label their rumination. A label that captures their circular style of thinking, such as my circular thinking, my hamster wheel thinking, my spaghetti thinking, are useful. When clients spot they are overthinking, they can label their thinking, there goes my spaghetti thinking, and then take steps to disengage from rumination. In this therapy clip, we see the therapist guide the client to discover the effects, the harmful effects of ruminating. So I'm wondering if we could take a few minutes to really look at the effects of ruminating.
Okay.
And the way I like to do this is to have you imagine a scenario and how you might think and act in that scenario. So let me give you the scenario and you can imagine it. So I want you to imagine you have this really important job interview. It's tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. and you get up early, you get ready, you jump in your car, you put the key in the ignition and the car doesn't start. And you start to think, why is this happening to me? Why do bad things always happen to me? Why won't my car start? Why can't I get to the interview in enough time to be there early? Why do bad things like this happen to me? How might you be feeling in that situation?
I'll probably be feeling quite deflated and anxious, and um, just remembering all the times where bad things have happened to me before. Um, I'll probably be feeling like I can't get to the job interview, and um, that I'm just quite unlucky and cursed.
Exactly. And with those kinds of thoughts in your mind, why do these things always happen to me? Why can't I get to the job interview early? What might you then be inclined to do?
I might end up just giving up and feeling like there's no way of me getting to the interview, and maybe cancelling it and just going back home feeling deflated.
Yeah, exactly. So going back home and potentially missing the interview. Yeah,
Yeah.
difficult situation. So what I want us to do now is to reimagine that scenario again. So you have this really important job interview tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. You get up early, you get ready, you jump in your car, you put the key in the ignition, and it doesn't start. And this time you think, now how can I get to the job interview by 9 a.m.? How can I get there on time? How
Yeah.
might you be feeling in this situation?
I can imagine feeling calmer and more in control, and like there's actually a solution to this problem, and a chance that I could still make the job interview. So I'll be feeling a lot more like a lot more hopeful.
Brilliant. Excellent. And with that sort of thought in mind, how can I get to the job interview by 9 a.m.? How can I get there on time? What might that then lead you to do?
I'd probably consider whether I could take public transport and have a look on Google Maps to see how I could get there and what time I would get there. I'd also consider whether I could take an Uber, and probably go back in the house and start making arrangements to either take an Uber or get the bus.
Exactly. So it sounds like in that situation, when you're thinking about how can I get there on time, rather than why did this problem happen, you're much more likely to be effective in problem solving.
Yeah, I'm more likely to find a solution and actually get to the interview on time.
Hmm. And the first type of thinking where we were looking at the effect of ruminating, so why did this problem happen? Why is it happening to me? Which led to kind of giving up in a sense and didn't really lead to any answers that were helpful for the situation. How does that relate to your trauma and the type of thinking that's been going through your mind since the trauma?
Well, it kind of just keeps me in a vicious cycle of thinking the same thing, and asking questions that never have an answer, um, and just not really moving forward. Just just staying stuck in the same place, really.
Yeah. So ruminating hasn't really been that helpful for your trauma.
No, it just keeps me thinking about the same thing over and over again.
Right. So I'm wondering if a helpful next step, now that we understand the effects of ruminating, would be to come up with a plan together to put in place once you spot that you are ruminating.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Great. For clients who are plagued with prominent why questions about the trauma, it can be helpful to update the most prominent why questions with updating information. We know that rumination is often meaningfully linked to appraisals of self-blame or betrayal. Rumination is also common in people who feel wronged by others. People who have experienced medical trauma or assault, for example. Appraisals may be about that justice will not be done, or the injustice will be forgotten if they stop thinking about it. The therapist and client can create flashcards with new information to help address questions such as, why did the trauma happen, or why didn't I do more to prevent the trauma, the prominent why questions. The client will then remind themselves of the updating information once they spot the question has popped to mind, label their thinking, then take steps to disengage from their repetitive thoughts. Updating information for why questions often becomes apparent during imaginal reliving or narrative writing and hotspot updating. In this therapy clip, we see the therapist and the client work together to identify updating information to answer her prominent why question, which was, why was I attacked? The client believed that she was attacked because she must have done something to anger the perpetrators, and therefore it was her fault. So we've had a chance to go through your hotspots, Sienna, and some of the helpful information included possible reasons why you were attacked. Do you remember what these were?
Yeah, we looked at the police report and it said it was a random act of violence, could have been racially motivated, and that the perpetrators were on drugs.
Exactly, brilliant. And do you remember we also created a pie chart and we were looking at contributing factors for the attack when we were working on the pie chart together? Do you remember what you discovered when we did that?
That it wasn't my fault that it happened. There were a lot of other factors that played a role.
Exactly. And we also did a survey together, didn't we? And we got other people's views on what had happened. And what did we discover with this survey?
Similar, no one thought it was my fault. Also, no one thought I could have prevented it.
And so did the attack have anything to do with what you did at the time?
No.
Great. Okay. So I'm wondering if it might be helpful to capture this information in a flashcard, perhaps you could share screen and start to write out a flashcard which captures this new information all in one place. So what we're aiming to do here is to come up with an answer to that why question that frequently comes to mind, which is, why was I attacked?
Yeah, that would be helpful. So I'll write at the top, why was I attacked?
Right. Excellent. And so what are some of those reasons that we now know?
It was a random act of violence and the perpetrators were on drugs.
Excellent. And what else did we discover in the police report about why the attack happened?
It might have been racially motivated.
Yeah, exactly. Well done. And we discovered another key piece of information in the survey, didn't we? Do you remember what that was about why you may have been attacked?
I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time.
That's right. Great, well done. And looking at this information, the likely reason why the attack happened, I'm wondering what might be helpful now to do when that question pops to mind, why was I attacked?
Reading this flashcard will help.
Yep, very, very well done. Reading the flashcard will help. Reading it once will help. And then what I think would also be helpful is to move on from dwelling, move on from that question to a reclaiming life activity. And I'm wondering what reclaiming life activity sounds like it might be manageable for you to do after you've read the flashcard once.
I could do my 7-minute exercise app.
That's fantastic. Brilliant. Well done. And here we see Sienna's flashcard. Why was I attacked? It was not my fault. It was a random act of violence. The attackers were on drugs and it was likely racially motivated. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And Sienna was guided to look at her flashcard once when this why question popped to mind, and then to engage in a reclaiming life activity. It can also be very helpful to experiment with clients in creating rumination-free zones or to delay rumination as a way to interrupt the cycle of rumination. So what we would want to do here is have the client identify a room in their house or their flat where they spend a lot of time, and we'd want that to be the rumination-free zone. And then to identify a room in their house or their flat where they don't spend much time. Perhaps that's the bathroom, and that would be their rumination zone. And then what they're guided to do is to spot when they are ruminating in their rumination-free zone, such as the kitchen. And when they spot that they're doing that in their kitchen, they're meant to leave the kitchen and go to their rumination room, perhaps the bathroom, and could carry on ruminating. And what clients discover is that when they spot they are ruminating in the kitchen, for example, they don't want to leave the task at hand and go into another room to ruminate. They want to carry on with what they're doing. So it's a very useful way to interrupt the cycle of rumination. Similarly, we can guide clients to experiment with delaying rumination. So clients may give themselves permission to ruminate for half an hour at 7 o'clock at night, and then if they note that they're ruminating at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, they make a note of the thought that they're ruminating about and delay it to 7 o'clock at night. And then what they notice is when 7 o'clock rolls around, they actually don't want to carry on that line of thinking. They want to carry on with their evening. So this is also a very useful tool, another very useful tool in helping clients to disengage from rumination, to interrupt that cycle. So the overall goal is to guide clients to disengage from rumination. And so it's important that we interrupt the cycle of rumination in order to help them to disengage from rumination. So spotting, then labeling rumination is helpful to interrupt the cycle of rumination. Developing likely answers to prominent why questions with updating information is helpful, and then having clients read a flashcard you've created with them, which answers a prominent why question, and then engage in a reclaiming life activity to interrupt the cycle of rumination. Experimenting with rumination-free zones or delaying rumination is a very useful way to interrupt the cycle of rumination, or engaging in reclaiming life activities. As soon as they spot they're ruminating, making the awareness that they're ruminating a cue to engage in a reclaiming life activity as a way to interrupt that ruminative cycle. It can also be very helpful, of course, to prevent rumination from starting in the first place. And in order to do this, we need to spot and address triggers for rumination. So common triggers will be trauma triggers. Trauma triggers may trigger episodes of rumination. There may be particular situations for a client that are associated with rumination, such as being at home alone in the evening without plans. Particular feelings, such as feeling overwhelmed or exhausted, may trigger rumination. Particular thoughts, such as asking myself why me or why, or having self-critical thoughts, may trigger rumination. Certain behaviors may trigger rumination, such as putting things off, avoiding people, thinking rather than doing, and perhaps particular body sensations may trigger rumination for particular clients, such as feeling tense or on edge. When trauma triggers trigger rumination, we would intervene with then versus now. When other triggers trigger rumination, we would encourage the client to respond to the trigger with a reclaiming life activity. So if, for example, they're at home alone in the evening without plans, and this is a particular trigger for ruminating, we'd want them to try a reclaiming life activity in that situation, such as calling a friend or going for a walk. Of course, it's going to be very important in your sessions with your clients to spot rumination in session and to agree with them how you're going to interrupt rumination when you notice it's happening in the session. And finally, in this video clip, we hear from a patient who had PTSD, who we treated, whose trauma was the attempted suicide of a colleague for which he intervened. And this linked to an earlier trauma in his life when his brother died by suicide and he wasn't able to intervene. So the client believed very strongly that he should have intervened much faster than the 30 minutes within which he did intervene, because he had this life experience and it should have made him super skilled at being able to identify that his colleague was at risk. And so he believed that he should have helped much sooner than the 30 minutes that he did help. And he did save his colleague's life. And in this video, we hear him talk about how he disengaged from rumination.
A colleague of mine attempted suicide, and myself and a few other colleagues had to resuscitate this person, which had quite a lasting effect on me. It's not really my first time in this sort of situation. My brother didn't commit suicide, but he died under sort of a similar circumstance where I had to force entry and find him in the state that he was. And this was before I'd ever started the course, so I wasn't medically trained. The ones that came first were flashbacks, unwanted memories popping up, unintended times, and anything that resembled that same situation. For example, the exam that I had the following week, which was what to do in that same situation, would give me panic attacks. So anything that sort of reminded me would trigger me, I guess. I would say in terms of long-term effects, guilt was the biggest one, because that was just a recipe for the ultimate dwelling scenario. A few weeks afterwards, I just kept thinking to myself, man, I didn't learn from the first time. This shouldn't be happening under the same roof that I live, because I've had a previous experience. How many lives do I have to lose to learn my lesson, to intervene when I'm needed. But again, I've already explained it's not really down to me. It's down to the person in question who attempted suicide. And I just kept thinking were my compressions deep enough? When I gave mouth to mouth, did that actually go into our lungs, or did that go into through the esophagus? Did I delay intervention by using an alternative method of entry first before just banging it down with a fire hydrant? If I just went straight to the fire hydrant instead, would that have saved some few valuable seconds? the first thing I had to do was become better at recognizing when I'm dwelling. And I know that sounds like how could you not know you're dwelling? Like it's in your head, you're doing it. But sometimes I find myself doing it and not even realizing that I was going in a downward spiral, and then my mood would drop, and that I'd have a bad day. So it was recognizing it the moment it would come. So that was the first thing. Second thing was when I was starting to do it, I'd have to try and override those thoughts with not positive thoughts, but more objective reminders about the helpful things that I did. So when I was thinking, oh man, I could have handled the airway better, I just remind myself that I did really good compressions. When I'm thinking about how I took too much time to decide to force entry, I just remind myself, well, at the end of the day, you did force entry and you did it within a short period of time, regardless of whether or not it could have been shorter. At the end of the day, ultimately, it was a very short period of time that I decided to force entry. So just replacing those negative, self-criticisms with, self-praising was the next major thing. Like coming to terms with that I wasn't a hindrance to that person's survival. If anything, I gave that person a chance. All of my colleagues did, but it was just finally accepting that it wasn't because of me. And if anything, that person is alive today because, of course, I was going to have some days where like it would overwhelm me and I'd still dwell regardless. And in those days, I just had to make sure that I didn't just sit there and just stew on it. So I would, exercise, lift some weights, feel something, which would give me something to feel proud of, I guess. Like if I broke a personal record in a workout, then I feel good about that. Or I could play on a PS4 or play badminton with housemates, or I don't know, just do something else, cook tofu. I don't know. Just doing something and not just sitting there and like letting myself do it.
So in summary, in addressing rumination in cognitive therapy for PTSD, the goal is to help clients to discover what rumination is, why it's unhelpful, and how they may disengage from rumination or prevent it from starting in the first place. You don't need to use all of the interventions covered in this video. Some clients will benefit from a few of the interventions, whilst other clients will benefit from all of them. The interventions that you'll most likely need to use are making the distinction between intrusive memories and rumination for your clients, guiding clients to discover the effects of rumination, spotting and labeling rumination, and helping clients to interrupt the cycle of ruminative thoughts. For more information, please see the oxcataresources.com website, and I'd like to thank you for your attention.